You are listening to Win Win, a podcast brought to you by the global nonprofit organization WIN, Women in Innovation. Each episode features inspiring innovators from the startup world, innovation consultancies, and Fortune 500 companies who share their innovation secrets and career trajectories every Monday. As for me, I'm your host, Zoya Kozakov, Global Product Lead at WIN by night and Product Manager by day. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Win Win podcast. And summer is in full swing, and I personally just feel this tide shifting in the best of ways. And I hope that the sunshine is doing good things for you as well, especially on this Monday. Today's guest is yet another incredible leader and person. Cheryl Sew Hoy is the founder and CEO of Tiny Health, the first ever at-home baby gut health testing company that helps families detect gut imbalances in the critical first 1,000 days and take action to avert long-term chronic health conditions for babies. If that in itself was not enough of an accomplishment, Cheryl was also named Time Person of the Year in 2017, along with the other women or silence breakers who came out with their stories of sexual harassment, which is what led to the Me Too movement. She has had her former startup acquired. Cheryl launched an innovation ecosystem in Malaysia in partnership with the Obama administration. And she's just the kind of human that you would wonder whether she has the same number of hours in a day as we do, because on top of all of that, she's also a mother of two. Before we jump into the conversation, I also want to call out how special it is to have the kind of guest who doesn't just run through their story that they've told in a narrative that they've perfectly crafted. Cheryl's honesty and perspective is so refreshing, and that's something I do not take for granted, as these are the kinds of conversations that move us as women collectively forward and as people too, of course. So with that, here is Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. Welcome to the Win Win podcast.
Hi, thanks, Zoya. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you, especially because you have had a career that would probably take 3 podcast episodes for us to dissect. But I do want to break down a couple of key moments as we kick off getting to know you. You started your career in financial and professional services, and shortly after you became a co-founder and CEO of City Pockets, a marketplace product for e-commerce, which was then acquired by Walmart Labs. So talk me through how you actually took that first leap of faith, especially since there is such crazy scrutiny around first-time founders.
Yeah, so there was really, what we call a digital wallet for daily deals at a time. And we started, your Groupon and Living Social vouchers that you were prepaying to get a discount later on. It was in around 2010 when that whole scene exploded. And I was a management consultant in New York. And, it was the financial downturn. And so a lot of the New York iBankers and consultants were either let go during the downturn or left the financial field to start their own tech companies. That was literally the beginning of New York tech. There wasn't really much tech before that. So it was really, I was really part of that. From management consultant to doing a tech startup. So the solution was sort of a digital wallet that would hold all your any digital currency that had value that could have an expiration date. So we started with daily deals, but we were going to go into gift cards, airline mileage, any kind of coupons that if you don't use would go to waste, and had a marketplace around trading those things as well as, kind of storing that, reminding you to use it. So that was my first company. It was really I knew I was going to quit consulting because I'd always sort of had the entrepreneurial blood in me. As a kid, I was always selling something. Mm-hmm. And so when you're miserable in your job, for me was consulting was pretty miserable at the time, doing a lot of cost cutting projects. I was really looking into what should I be doing with my life, and had some mentors who were starting tech companies and moving out to Silicon Valley from New York at the time that I was very lucky to be mentored by. And so was inspired to start a company. And I remember I had 4 or 5 ideas, and he was just kind of well, just pick one you're passionate about. And most importantly, pick a problem you're trying to solve that isn't already in the world, and just try it. Because you're going to pivot anyway, which obviously is true for many companies now. So I just picked one and ran with it. And again, like tech startups were just starting up in New York at the time. So it was really cool because I got invited, as a female founder too. Like there were a few of us at the time in 2010, 2011. So I got to be part of a lot of the initial founder breakfasts and co-working spaces in New York, like General Assembly and WeWork Labs when they had their first entrepreneurs. I was part of that cohort and really built my network from that time point. Yeah.
That all makes sense. And it's incredible to see that, whether formal or informal, that power of community can be the very thing that enables you to take that first step. But another really distinguishing career moment that I wanted to touch upon was that you founded and were the CEO of MAGIC, or the Malaysian Innovation and Creativity Center, which was a 30 million government-funded innovation program that was launched by President Obama in 2014. How did you approach building out frameworks or programs there where non-existent? I ask because, it's very different building a startup versus an initiative that has government funding and therefore government scrutiny.
Yeah, and how I got to that position too, because I was headhunted by the White House team and the Malaysian government to really, go back to Malaysia, where I'm originally from, to start to help build the startup ecosystem there. They saw me exiting to Walmart Labs for City Pockets, or Reclipit, which is what we eventually pivoted into. And that's a different story altogether there, how we got acquired. And, that whole acquisition story is, like you said, another podcast on its own. But I was headhunted to like build this ecosystem. And part of when, I went back, they were trying to like, can you build the Silicon Valley here? And I was almost like, no, like there's no such thing. You can't duplicate Silicon Valley. And why would we even want to do that when the ecosystem here is so unique? And a lot of it, I actually learned from how New York tech, going back to my early days and how I built the startup in New York versus California, was learning how do you adapt the startup ecosystem to the culture, the local culture, right? In New York, it was very fintech, media oriented, e-commerce and sports and things like that. And, how people think and operate is quite different from, the West Coast, for example, in Silicon Valley. Investors at the time in 2010 were very conservative, and they still wanted to see pro forma statements and financial statements. And that wasn't a culture in Silicon Valley, right? So when I first got the job as the founding CEO of MAGIC, they gave me $30 million, as you mentioned. I had to tell them, let's start from from scratch. I had to interview the entrepreneurs in the region, investors. So it's almost like I took the skills of what I used to build my first startup and doing a lot of customer development. Ultimately, who are you serving? What problems are you trying to solve? And really interview them, right? And really figure out what are the missing gaps and what is it in the local ecosystem that we needed to build? And a lot of it was the community. Coming back to, again, that New York tech community, and I saw how it was really the community that propelled the New York tech ecosystem forward and then kind of bridged to what was happening in Silicon Valley. So a lot of it, you can't build community without trust. And in Asia, there was a lot of mistrust in government systems and agencies. What is the agenda? Is there a political kind of like agenda behind it? So there was a lot of work that I had to do that, I'm an outsider, a successful exit with my company and trying to help entrepreneurs there. And I really had to go out and talk to founders, give speeches for them to see who I really am and really solve problems. And what is the quickest thing I could do to show progress, right? Because again, a lot of people can talk, but just like a startup, you need to show the output. You need to test quickly if something you're building is resonating with your audience, with your customers, get that product market fit feedback quickly. And so it was interesting how I was able to adapt a lot of this startup kind of ethos to building a startup ecosystem. And within 2 years, we showed so much impact in the regional Southeast Asian ecosystem that, it was basically 10 countries in Southeast Asia that made up about hundreds and millions of people. So we made a lot of progress, and I brought 500 startups to Asia and Techstars, and We bridged Stanford University's programs, entrepreneurship programs in Asia as well. So yeah, like we had a lot of success and published it really quickly so that everyone could see how well we were doing.
I do think as I hear you talk, and also transparently as I was stalking you online, or in other words, doing my research in preparation for this interview, I have to say, no innovator's resume is straightforward. It's typically so zigzaggy. When I was reading yours, looking at every step, each step was bigger and better and so different. It's one thing to launch a startup and have that startup be acquired. Completely different to launch this innovation ecosystem. How did you battle maybe doubt that you have had, or doubt others had about you being able to actually accomplish all of these things? Because I imagine it was really scary doing all of these things for the first time.
Yeah, very scary. And again, to an outsider, maybe looking at social media, it could look like a linear kind of growth, right? But it really isn't, right? It was very nonlinear for me. And at each point, I didn't know if I was going to come out on the other end, alive, or, so quickly, for example, before we got acquired by Walmart Labs, which, is on the surface looks like a really successful acquisition. And it was, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty okay acquisition. Like, it was more in a way an acqui-hire, I would admit, than a real life-changing acquisition. Before that, we were approached by another company as we were raising our next round, and that company was going to be an investor but offered to buy us. So they offered to acquire us. And then midway through the due diligence, because we exposed so much of how we built things, our IP, they ended up just copying the IP and not following through with the deal.
Oh my
and
God.
so that's the story that never got told, and I'm telling this for the first time in a very long time on a podcast. I don't think I've ever mentioned this in a podcast, frankly. So that, was really devastating, because we thought we were going to get this all cash exit, and it didn't happen. And then we went out running a whole process to get a company acquired, and it was not successful. I was not able to get another company to acquire us until we got to Walmart. I happened to be introduced to them by a mentor of mine. And I thought at that point, I've just given up and I'm there to ask for a job. And they were like, well, actually, we want to acquire your company because we're looking for this product. So the biggest lesson I learned there is that companies are not sold. Companies are bought, meaning you can't go and sell your company. It really has to be a strategic reason why the acquirer wants to acquire your company. For us, it was because Walmart, for the longest time, was not accepting coupons. They were the lowest price baked into the products, right, for the consumers. But then, and we were digitizing paper coupons at the time when we pivoted. They had changed their strategy because they realized consumers wanted to use coupons and wanted to feel like they found value and bring it into the store. So they were changing the strategy to kind of accept coupons. So, and they knew nothing about it. And we became that expert team that knew everything about it. And so that acquisition makes sense for Walmart Labs. So it really is down to the strategy. If you're looking at an exit in the future, you can't, plan to be, acquired, because it really depends on what the acquirer's core strategy and how important it is on their roadmap. So that was an example of something that really was nonlinear. And then for Magic, just real quick, it was ultimately a very political position. I didn't know how political it would be, but I had forgotten, having left Asia since 2002, and I'd never worked there. It was a very political environment and quite corrupted as well. So I know friends had warned me about that before I went back. And I thought, oh, nothing I can't handle, I thought, but it was really, I had death threats. There was a lot of racism against me. I had very little connections back then, and I had to build it from scratch, right? But I had one thing that sort of I always taken away from someone that he wasn't quite a mentor, but it's someone I looked up to. His advice to me was always make a decision where you would regret, not doing rather than regret doing. So, I might have done it and regretted it, but I would rather have done it than always wonder what, could have been if I had taken that job that I didn't end up taking. So that's been a guiding principle for me.
And, such a key takeaway for two reasons. One is, at the end of the day, there's more than one way to tell a story. Obviously, one more favorably and one maybe more honestly. And the second lesson is how you process all of the experiences and how you really see them as blessings and lessons rather than success versus failure. So I really appreciate that. On that note, another part of your story, and you've been featured in the media countless times, but one of them was so notable because you were one of the 61 women which were part of the Silence Breakers. For those who don't know, the Silence Breakers were the women that spoke out about their sexual harassment experiences and were a big part of the tipping point of what led to the Me Too movement. And that group was named as collectively the Time Person of the Year in 2017. So as were you. So as the 13th person to share your story, I imagine that getting this recognition was very meaningful. But I can also imagine that there is complexity between getting acknowledgement and recognition and trying to continue to build your career as Cheryl, the entrepreneur, and not just Cheryl, the silence breaker. So what role has that experience played in your career, and how have you grappled with it?
Looking back like a long time ago, but it was a really core part of my journey. I mentioned when I was doing work with Magic in Southeast Asia, part of that was bringing 500 startups to Asia. And so, Dave McClure, who was heading up 500 startups at the time, was a friend, and he had previously invested in me. And, I had this incident in my own apartment where he had, sexually harassed me. And there was this, start of the Me Too movement here was when Susan Fowler told her story about Uber and what happened at Uber. And then there was a series of women who also shared what happened to them, like what Dave McClure sort of like did to harass them. But it was sort of like, it wasn't enough. I felt like it was like kind of being dismissed as, oh, he's just being a loud mouth. He's just like saying things inappropriately. But the story about him actually physically harassing someone hadn't come out. And at that point, it was quite a struggle for me. On one hand, I feel like I needed to tell my story to get the true, like real physical incidences out beyond the verbal stuff. But there was a career risk, a potential career risk, right? And, before the Me Too movement, a lot of people who came out with these kinds of stories were blamed, right? The victims were always blamed. Mm-hmm. But I felt like I needed to do my role for other women who couldn't speak up. And at the time, I had just come off of doing Magic. My 2-year stint had ended. I returned to the US. I met my husband, and I was getting married at the time, and I was in between, my next thing. I hadn't founded another company at the time. So I wasn't fundraising. I think it's interesting if that moment, came about when I was fundraising for my startup, I wouldn't have been able to come up with that story. So because I had also had prior press and media written up about me at Magic, I was just in the news so much. And then prior to that, with City Pockets and Reclip It, we did a lot of media. I wasn't, it was very obvious I wasn't doing the sexual harassment news for press, which was always the accusation that they're looking for press. So that's one. And then two is I chose to tell the story on my own blog in my own voice rather than go to the press. Because, like with media and press, sometimes your stories get cut and edited for, whatever reason. I wanted to write very factual and emotional what happened, and then not just, blame the situation or the person. Really be constructive about what we as an industry can do next. What can the VC industry do? What can founders do? So it was really about that movement, which then propelled me to start a nonprofit called #Moving Forward with a few of my co-founders. So we turned that, into something that was positive. But truly, it was the timing of it that really, enabled me to speak up for other women. So I felt like I was not just doing it for myself, but other women who couldn't speak up at the time.
No, and that's truly incredible. I mean, on this podcast, a lot of the times when we talk about the role of gender in somebody's career, there's a different spectrum, and everyone has their own experiences and opinions. And a lot of the times, the point of view is, "Hey, I'm coming on this podcast. I'm excited to share and talk about my experiences." But on the day to day, I just try to be a CEO, or I just try to be a leader, and not like woman CEO, woman leader. At the same time, for many of us, gender and in your case, sexual harassment is a part of that story. But I think you've done an incredible job doing your part and really helping other women, and at the same time moving forward with such an incredible career. So just wanted to shout that out. So fast forwarding to 2020, at this point, you are an accomplished entrepreneur, even more so than before. You're a mother of 2 kids, and you decide to launch a first of its kind microbiome testing company designed for mothers, fathers, babies, after watching your daughters struggle with things like eczema and food sensitivity. Of course, our children are most important to us, but of all of the challenges that you could have taken on as an entrepreneur, what gave you the confidence and the drive to feel like you could have solved this one, especially in a field with so many barriers?
Yeah, this is a great question. It was kind of a journey too. Like I had my struggle, I had a C-section of my daughter, and then I had my struggle with her chronic conditions, as you mentioned. And that was when I was really doubling down on all the research on, was it my C-section that kind of like got her into this higher risk state for eczema, allergies, and things like that? What can I do about it? Can I course correct? And the answer for all of that is yes, there is a gut microbiome connection. And I learned how 80% of our immune system is in our gut, and we acquire it at birth through our moms, through the vaginal canal, if you have a vaginal birth. But like the baby is also acquiring the gut microbes from the mom's fecal fluid during the birthing process, and then ongoing through the breastfeeding process as well. So the acquisition and the initial kind of balance of microbes in the first 1,000 days is what trains the baby's immune system. So eczema and allergies are one of the first signs that the baby's immune system wasn't trained correctly. But because the infant gut is really malleable and easier to change in early life, because it's just so new, right? It's kind of like you're just seeding the microbes. It's much easier to course correct than later in life. Like once the kid is 5 and above, you can still change it as an adult. Like you and I can still change our gut. It just takes more discipline, maybe 6 to 9 months of a diet change or a supplement, like disciplined supplement intake and lifestyle change. For a baby, you can change it in 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. So given the profound findings and how strong the science is and the evidence is around published papers in this area, I thought it was a no-brainer. But I resisted it, to be frank. When I was thinking about starting my next company, I was an entrepreneur in residence at Silicon Valley Bank. I was doing some, CMO work for some other startups. And I was actually trying to start a SaaS company because SaaS was so hot back then a few years ago, still is. Well, now it's AI SaaS. And I really resisted myself from starting what you would categorize as like a very mom-oriented, female-oriented company because I didn't want to be kind of shoeboxed into that category. But then I sat around a table one time with a few other guy friends whom, they were all trying to start their own companies at the time too. And they were like, Cheryl, you have the perfect story for this with your kid. And, you have an engineering background and you're scientific enough. You've been reading all these papers. You should start this company. And all 3 of them were like, I would put in the first check to invest in this company. And finally I was like, why am I resisting this? And I took their checks. So they were the first 3 checks in.
I love
and
it.
they're my angel investors. And they all, 2 of them have kids. But it was sort of this moment where, why am I resisting this? And now obviously I've come full circle. So few, women have sort of this entrepreneurial background and desire or even experience. If not us, who else are going to solve our problems, right? Like that we're facing, we are the caretaker of our kids and our family. And we are we control most of the spending in e-commerce and healthcare as well. We are in charge of a lot of our family's health and food decisions and wellness decisions, right? So, now I'm realizing this is a gift to me and I need to start this company because no one else has this perspective. Of course, initially it was kind of like, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor. How do I really get into this field? So the first year was really spent, again, talking to, like not just potential customers, actually previous companies that work in the space. So like people who ran Ubiome and another microbiome company that failed due to more like executive fraud, frankly, insurance fraud. But I talked to folks there. I talked to a lot of people in the space. I talked to a lot of scientists. These papers I was reading from Johns Hopkins and whatnot. And then because I was even taking PhD level courses to understand the microbiome science behind it, I became sort of more credible in the space. And I knew I had to recruit advisory members from academia because I wanted academia to look at my company and be like, yep, they're really, working on the latest science. They know what they're talking about. I want our company to be respected by people actively doing research in the field. So we got a lot of those initial scientists from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic and whatnot on our board, and some even left to come found a company with me. And I also put in some initial of my own funding to fund a study with 9 moms and follow the kids in the first year. So, I wanted to, when I raised money, have some data to back up what I was trying to solve.
And you've come so far from that point. I know you recently announced your Series A, which was 8.5 million, and your total funding is now at 13 million. We'll definitely talk about your fundraising experience, but I did want to ask, in the spirit of continuing to tell authentic stories, I know from having so many founder friends and being in the VC community myself that so many times founders have this like moments of giving up and they're like, how are we going to recover from this? Or like being so close to shutting down the company. Between then and now, is there a moment that you're able to share that you almost gave up maybe and instead decided to carry on and became pivotal to your story?
I think that was more true for my first company. As a first-time founder, I had many of those self-doubt moments. Are we in the right industry? Solving the right problem? This time around, I was very intentional about what kind of company I wanted to start. It was a very mission-driven company, something that I would call my life's work. Like, sometimes when you build a company, you're like, okay, maybe I'll build this for 5-10 years and sell it. This company, I can see myself running for life, frankly.
Wow.
Not that, I'm sure my investors want me to get an exit at some point, but I think you do need to come from that passion, right? That angle of like, I'm solving something so important and so crucial and needed in the world. And almost everyone I recruited to join the team feels the same way. And therefore, they're kind of a really good culture fit. But I think it was more like, it was never a time where I felt like quitting. It was more like, we raised our first round in 2021 at the height of the frothiness, so to speak, right? It was very easy. It took me 2 months. And I had nothing. I just had a deck and the data that I mentioned earlier. And because I was a second time, successful entrepreneur, it was easier to raise money back then. But I was very disciplined about using the money. I didn't use it. I barely used it. I almost like knew how hard money was to come by, period. I parked away $2.5 million and assumed I only had $2 million to run with, that I didn't deserve to like kind of tap into that resource until I've proven product market fit. That was my sole goal with the seed round. And I think it should be for any founder. And so when we finally got some signs of product market fit, that's when I knew and we had some amazing traction just from parents and families really, really wanting and needing this test. That's when I headed out to raise our A with $2.5 million left in the bank. So we were at a pretty good position. We didn't need the money. And that was a key point for us. I learned from my first startup is don't raise money when you're like kind of dying and running out of money and at a desperation point, because that's kind of, VCs can smell that, right? So raise from a point of strength. You don't need the money, but you want it to grow faster and build different parts of your businesses. So I would say like that even though we started raising at a really tough time, right? Last year when, last year was 2023, it was still kind of I don't know if last year was worse in terms of like the economy. And I think maybe last year is a little bit worse. We see a pickup in Q1 in 2024. But we did only just close our round in March of 2024. So definitely towards Q4, we got our term sheet in Q3, and we had competing term sheets too. So we were in a way a good position to get the valuation up because of the competing term sheets. However, again, like it feels like, oh yeah, she's had such success raising money, but you know what? I think I got 100 plus, maybe 110 rejections that said no. So each time I feel like if I had 2-3 no's in a row in a day, my fourth pitch sucked because I was like low confident at that point. So it really makes a difference if I had some sort of like positive, like, oh yes, let's get to the next stage. And then my next pitch would be more confident. But it shows like how much of fundraising it's confidence, right? And so I really had to remind myself that just erase whatever just happened and kind of like project the same level of confidence each time fresh. It's mentally exhausting as you can. Yeah. So it's really, you need to build that stamina. And, I wouldn't say fundraising is my favorite thing, but it's just something that as a founder, CEO, you have to be good at.
Totally. And, another exciting thing to bring up as a part of this raise, you announced 2 new board members, both of which are women, Laura Gonzalez-Estefany and Sarah Eshelman. Besides that fact, and as well as that fact, I imagine that there's so much to be excited about now that you're on the other side of the fundraise and have actually gotten the money. So tell me more about where you are at with Tiny Health. You shared about the founding story, but where are you at with it now, and what are you most excited to kind of take on?
Yeah, I mean, we've just been blown away by how much demand there is. And just, I think under 2 years, we've served over 25,000 families, and 70% of them, have a child with some sort of chronic condition. We're really actively helping out with 70 to 80% success rate in terms of like improving their microbiomes and their symptoms. Wow. And the other 30% are just people who are curious about their microbiomes and trying to optimize, which is also great and really proactive, and that's what I would do. So the next sort of like phase for us is really in the B2B side of the business, which a lot of people don't know we have. We're helping a lot of clients run clinical trials, clinical studies. They actually came to us first. A lot of nutrition companies or research-oriented companies wanted to use our microbiome kits for their clinical trials. So that's been a really fast-growing side of the business. And then the practitioner side has been increasing too. So patients keep bringing their results to their doctors, and doctors are like, what is Tiny Health? So now we have a practitioner arm that helps educate them about how to interpret our microbiome tests, because we have vaginal and also gut for all ages. And so that part of the business is also growing, building out more tooling for practitioners and whatnot. And then we also have we're a very research-oriented company. We have a few exciting things we're announcing soon, more like, how we can leverage our platform to give back to science and research on different topics. So that's sort of the B2B side of the business is what I'm personally most excited about.
Yeah, and there's so much opportunity to tap into already on top of the great impact that you've made. So I'm sure it's very exciting. I know we started touching on the topic of what's next for you, but I would love to end the podcast with a question that I ask all of our innovators, and that is, where do you see yourself and your industry 1 month from now, 1 year from now, and 10 years from now?
Yeah, and so that 1 month from now was kind of what I was alluding to. We're going to launch a huge fertility study in June that I'm really excited about, because for the first time, we're showing connections between the gut microbiome and the vaginal microbiome with fertility. There's been some research, but not enough, because women weren't even included in clinical studies until 1993, which is crazy. So there's been a lot of excitement in the space, especially as it relates to fertility issues. So we're really excited to work on to kind of announce that in June. but also moving forward, so many research partners investigating different areas of concern like autism and, prebiotics and just even stuff that I can't really mention right now. But in a month, you'll find out more. And then in a year, I think, again, I think where we would be is we want to be a company that you think of when you think about the microbiome, when you think about not just testing, but also who's sort of a credible source behind it when you want to find out more about your gut or vaginal health. And so hopefully in a year's time, we would have published quite a few papers that we want and have established some key partnerships that we're working on right now. And then also we welcome more sort of FDA kind of oversight because the microbiome industry has been this wild, wild west. But we really want to sort of be recognized as an industry leader that is very credible. And then in 10 years, I've always kind of had this vision, maybe even in 5 years, that we would be the standard for care for mom and babies. When you get pregnant or you're trying to conceive, you do a vaginal and gut microbiome tests, because there's so many connections there to a healthy pregnancy and even ease of getting pregnant. And then to your infant, there's primordial effects. What we call primordial means it's benefiting both the mom and the baby at the same time. So you can really truly prevent chronic conditions, which is really affecting almost 1 in 2 kids, according to the CDC today, has a chronic condition, which is a lot. I mean, this should not be the new normal.
Right.
So we're hoping to change the numbers on those in 10 years. And to do that, we really have to be the standard of care. When you have a newborn, you do a microbiome test and track it over time to really course correct earlier to prevent chronic conditions. So I am very hopeful that we would get there.
And lots in store for you both in a month, a year, and 10 years. So thank you so much for sharing that, as well as the rest of your story. I really enjoyed having you on today.
Thank you, Zoya. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Win-Win, brought to you by WIN, Women in Innovation, and myself, Zoya Kozakov. If you enjoy this podcast, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit womeninnovation.co to learn more about our organization, programming, and other opportunities. And remember, when women innovate, we all win.